as we discussed with the Constitutional Convention, ratification of the Constitution, you have two sides of the debate. One that is favoring more federal power, another that is favoring to continue with more state than federal power. Maybe not keep the Articles of Confederation as they existed, but only make minor changes rather than a sweeping overhaul like the Constitution turned out to be. These two sides are, if you remember, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And these two sides turn into the first ever political parties. To start this presentation, we got to discuss what happens when President Washington takes office as the first president of the United States. Washington immediately establishes a policy of neutrality to avoid getting in any foreign wars, and he also establishes the tradition of a presidential cabinet or a group of advisors to help him debate issues. Cabinet meetings were often very argumentative because he had people from different schools of thought in his cabinet, but Washington did so very intentionally. He wanted to hear those arguments, and he thought, it'll help me make well-informed decisions. In a kind of unintentional way, though, Washington having this argumentative cabinet led to the formation of the first political parties. And the last tradition that Washington established was refusing to run for a third term as president. It kind of establishes this tradition of a two-term limit that doesn't actually become a constitutional provision until the 1950s. All of these traditions, neutrality, a cabinet of advisors, a two-term limit, all these things are known as the Unwritten Constitution. You can see here Washington himself, his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, his Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox. Two of the people that butted heads the most in Washington's cabinet were Hamilton and Jefferson. And the biggest thing that they argued about was Hamilton's financial plan for the country. Hamilton believed that by establishing his system, it would be a way to repay national and state debts. Establishing a national bank would allow tax revenues to go somewhere, and those tax revenues to then be loaned out to, say, new businesses or government-funded infrastructure projects. And the last piece to this was protective tariffs. Tariffs are a very specific kind of tax against foreign goods, and this would protect American industries from foreign competition. He also wanted some domestic excise taxes. So these tariffs are on foreign goods, excise taxes are on domestic goods, and all of these different taxes collected would help pay the nation's debts and also help pay for these loans and infrastructure projects. So this is a huge topic of debate in Washington's cabinet. Now, the Federalists, they kept their name from the Constitutional Convention. They are led by Hamilton. They promote this financial plan. They claim that the Constitution allowed for policies like Hamilton's financial plan through the necessary and proper clause. That's the actual language found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It's actually really known as the elastic clause. That's what it's most commonly referred to as. This is referred to as loose construction, that allowing for policies through the elastic clause could get things done. They supported Hamilton's plan because they thought it would provide strength and stability to the federal government, and stability means economic growth. A national bank could provide loans to new businesses. This would also spur economic growth. And tariffs would promote U.S. businesses against European competitors, again, spurring economic growth. So you can see the priorities of the Federalist Party is, and I'll abbreviate, economic growth. In contrast, you have the Democratic Republicans. Instead of the Anti-Federalists, they established this party named the Democratic Republicans. They believed the plan was unconstitutional and that the Elastic Clause was not meant for this purpose. That is known as strict construction. And what that means is that as opposed to loose construction, hey, the Elastic Clause really allows us to get these types of things done. Strict construction was, no, it does not say anything like that in the Constitution, and the Elastic Clause is not meant for this. They argued against the plan because it assumed all state debts under one national debt, and Jefferson came from a state, Virginia, that had already paid off all of its debts. And he didn't want Virginia to now be responsible, once the national government took on all the state debts, for helping pay off the debts of less responsible states like New York, where Alexander Hamilton was from. And so the debt issue was a very serious debate. Lastly, the national bank, and this is the biggest debate. Debt was bad enough, national bank. Hamilton and Jefferson argue over this repeatedly. And Jefferson's Democratic Republicans thought that a national bank would only benefit northern merchants and not southern farmers. So it became like a regional issue as well. So long before slavery is a huge topic of debate, long before abolition is a full-on movement, there's kind of a north-south divide right from the get-go over Hamilton's financial plan, particularly the national bank. Now, early on, the excise taxes that Hamilton wanted to collect to fund government infrastructure projects and loans to new businesses, etc., one of those excise taxes is on whiskey. And this caused whiskey producers in western Pennsylvania to violently protest the tax. And so Washington is like, we cannot allow this to spiral out of control like Shays' Rebellion, or people will have no confidence in the new constitutional government. So he sends federal troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. The severity of the response is totally not necessary, but Washington wanted to make an example of the situation to prevent future rebellions. And you can see him here gathering large numbers of troops and issuing orders to end the rebellion. He himself led these troops to put down the rebellion. And it was more symbolic than anything else. Then you have, after Washington leaves office, and we will double back to talk a little bit more about Washington in tomorrow's presentation about his farewell address. That is its own important conversation to have. But after he left office, his vice president, John Adams, becomes president. And the nation is very divided, obviously, mainly over the banking issue. And he faced some early challenges, such as the XYZ affair. French diplomats were attempting to bribe U.S. government officials over the seizing of cargo on trading vessels on the Atlantic. And after a brief war, known as the Quasi-War, between the U.S. and French navies in the Caribbean, Napoleon comes to power in France, and a peaceful settlement is reached because Napoleon doesn't want to bother with this issue with the United States. But the XYZ affair was essentially bribery. Not essentially, it was downright bribery. And you had a Federalist congressman named Robert Goodloe Harper who's quoted as saying, "Millions for defense, but not one penny for tribute," meaning we would rather fight them than pay these bribes. Luckily, the issue was sorted out after Napoleon came to power. The real reason people ended up disliking the Federalist Party so strongly was the Alien and Sedition Acts. There was a lot of debate over things like the National Bank, but there were just as many people who thought the idea sounded good as there were bad, hence the division. One thing that was universally disliked is the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act was a law that said the president can deport foreigners who were considered a danger to the public safety. The thing is, who has the discretion to decide that? The president. And a lot of foreigners were more supportive of the Democratic Republicans than they were the Federalists. So this was being utilized by the Federalists to get rid of some of their political opponents. Likewise, with the Sedition Act, it said that the government can fine and or imprison newspaper editors who write any, quote, scandalous and malicious articles against the government. This should sound familiar. This sounds like John Peter Zenger being put on trial. And so, again, the Federalist Party and President Adams and his allies in Congress were using the Sedition Act to target their political enemies. And the response is almost immediate. The states of Virginia and Kentucky issue resolutions claiming the right to nullify, which just means to totally disregard, the acts coming out of the federal government as unconstitutional or a violation of the Bill of Rights, and that would go back to not only specific rights like the First Amendment, but also referring to states' rights things coming out of the Ninth and 10th Amendment. The result is that President Adams and the Federalist majority in Congress supported the laws and lost a ton of support as a result. So, as I mentioned, the financial plan debate was already controversial enough, but it was really the Alien and Sedition Acts that turned people against the Federalist Party because they were viewed as abusing their power, and the result is that the election of 1800 is overwhelmingly supportive of the Democratic Republicans. There's a tie vote in the Electoral College for president for both Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and both of those men were Democratic Republicans. So the third place finisher is a Federalist, John Adams, running for re-election. And the House of Representatives votes to support Jefferson. They actually passed the 12th Amendment shortly thereafter to prevent future tie votes. And the election of 1800 actually comes to be known as the Revolution of 1800. Not meaning that there was any violence, just meaning that there was a major change, and that was from one party controlling the government to another. Shortly after Jefferson takes office in 1801, the western border of the U.S. was the Mississippi River, but the port of New Orleans was extremely valuable, particularly for trade. You have to remember this is prior to the widespread use of what will be invented by Robert Fulton in a couple more years after this, and that is the steamboat. So upstream travel is not really possible. So when you look at this map that includes the Louisiana Purchase, I'll get more in detail on that in a minute, but downstream travel on the Mississippi River is the only real way to get goods to market. And right here at the mouth of the Mississippi River flowing out into the Gulf of Mexico is the port of New Orleans. Jefferson would love nothing more than to own the port of New Orleans. So Jefferson sends an envoy to France to offer up to $10 million for the port city. They were shocked when they get there because Napoleon's government offers the entire Louisiana territory, colored in salmon pink here, for the bargain basement price of only $15 million. So only half again as much for the entire Louisiana territory. This was largely due to the fact that Napoleon's government was needing to fund its wars in Europe and therefore didn't really want to have any attachment to the Americas anymore. So they just wanted to unload the Louisiana territory altogether. This leads Jefferson to really struggle with the issue, should he abide by strict or loose construction? He's always been a strict constructionist, Jefferson has. But if he can find it in himself to loosely interpret the Constitution, it would allow, based on that language of necessary and proper, known as the Elastic Clause, to purchase Louisiana without any problems. Jefferson eventually agrees with the Federalists in Congress that are supporting the idea and supporting his use of loose construction in this instance, and the treaty with Napoleon is not only signed by Jefferson, but easily approved by the Senate and the size of the United States doubles. You see in this painting, a very famous one, of the expedition of Lewis and Clark, these men here, who actually probably would have frozen to death had it not been for their guide, Sacagawea. She is mispronounced in history as Sacagawea. Her name was actually Sacagawea, and Lewis and Clark hands down would have died without her as their guide. And so very, very significant figure in history she was. And they explored this new territory. And to this point, the Lewis and Clark expedition, dating all the way back to when the Spanish were first coming back to the New World after Columbus had supposedly discovered the New World, that they're looking for a passage through to the Pacific Ocean. Remember, the original purpose for the voyages into the Western Hemisphere was to find a direct path to India and China. So it is not surprising that despite the fact that they were logging plenty of information about the wildlife and the geography, they were also continuing to look for what they referred to as the Northwest Passage to get to the Pacific Ocean. That concludes our presentation on the first party system and the very early parts of the early republic in general. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.